class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review, and this time around we've got former Sharks forward Kevin Labanc. And Labanc has one of the more interesting yet kind of sad stories amongst all San Jose Sharks players this past season. It begins in the 2014 draft when he was taken by the San Jose Sharks in the 6th round, and you usually don't expect to get any sort of NHL talent out of the 6th round, never mind a player who actually scores as many points as Kevin Labanc did, and definitely not as quickly as he did. Maybe like 5 to 6 years down the line they'll finally find themselves, but Kevin Labanc, it was only a couple of years before he made his NHL debut in 16-17, and as he worked his way through his entry-level contract, he constantly saw an increase in points leading up to the 18-19 season, the final year of his deal, where because the Sharks were such a deep offensive forward team, especially with the acquisition of Gustav Nyquist at the trade deadline that year, Labanc found himself on a really strong third line with Marcus Sorensen and especially centerman Joe Thornton, who was still playing very well at that point in his career. And so Labanc put up a 56-point season, partially because of that even strength ice time, but also because he was a bit of a power play specialist on a top unit with a really strong San Jose Sharks team, as I mentioned. He also immortalized his name in San Jose Sharks history with his 4-point performance on the 4 goals that the San Jose Sharks scored on that 5-minute major in Game 7 against the Vegas Golden Knights in first round, including the goal that would make it 4-3, that would get that go-ahead for the San Jose Sharks. So Labanc will be remembered somewhat fondly at the very least for that. And so at the end of that season, Labanc's contract was up and it was expected he would sign a relatively sizable deal. The problem is that the San Jose Sharks really didn't have much cap space to work with. They decided to make the aggressive move, I'll call it that, to sign Erik Karlsson to an $11.5 million deal. Then Timo Meier was a bigger priority coming off of his own entry-level contract. They gave him an extension. They already had to give up on signing captain Joe Pavelski, allowing him to walk over to Dallas, and so there really wasn't a lot of money to toss around when it came to re-signing Kevin Labanc. In the end, he would get a 1-year, $1 million contract, catching all Sharks fans completely off guard and even people around the NHL by surprise. This was one of the most illogical seemingly deals of the entire offseason that year, and even of anything we have seen. A player who had scored 56 points signing just for $1 million for 1 year made very little sense. Maybe you could justify it as like a prove-it deal, but Labanc was coming off of an entry-level contract where he saw constant improvement. One would think you would want to lock them down long term, or at the very least on some sort of more realistic bridge deal. 1 year, $1 million didn't really make any sense. That brings us to the 1920 season, where as the San Jose Sharks fell off a cliff completely as a team, finishing 3rd last that year, Kevin Labanc followed suit. His offensive production was nowhere near the 56 points he had the previous season, and it started to become more clear that he was maybe more so of a power play specialist and couldn't really hang it in the NHL, at least not in a top 6 role at even strength. And that season his contract would once again expired, and it was expected that he would sign for less than what he was likely worth last year, maybe in the $2 million range. But in the end, Doug Wilson signs him to yet another illogical deal, 4 years, $4.725 million, way above what you would expect a 33-point player to actually get. And so 2 straight contracts that just didn't seem to make any sense in context of their respective seasons. However, I have always held the opinion that some level of under-the-table deal here did exist between Doug Wilson and Kevin Labanc. Nothing will be confirmed, as I believe this would be technically considered illegal in the NHL, as this sort of cap circumvention would be occurring, but it seemed as though the Sharks didn't have the cap space in 18-19 to give Labanc a competitive offer, and so Doug Wilson came up to him and said, you know what, if you take this 1 year, $1 million deal, we'll make it square the following season. And Labanc seemed to go with that. Doug Wilson stuck with that deal, because if you actually take into account his 2 contracts, you put them together over a 5-year period, that's 5 years, $4 million. Very fair type of deal for the 56-point season that he had put up. So even though he had fallen off a cliff, it seemed as though Doug Wilson wanted to stick with it, wanted to stick with his word, be that honorable type of person, and gave Labanc a contract that at that point he was no longer anywhere near worth. And it never never quite got any better. He constantly got worse and worse, and with the arrival of David Quinn as head coach of the San Jose Sharks, it fell off a cliff even faster. Labanc and David Quinn never truly saw eye to eye. Labanc would ride the bench as a healthy scratch many times over, being benched for objectively worse players than him because he just didn't seem to play the right way, or at least the way that David Quinn wanted him to. And this season in particular really stood out for that. Just 46 games played. It was barely even across the mark, which is half the season for me to even bother reviewing him as a player, but he does just barely get there. 2 goals, 7 assists for just 9 points is his worst offensive output of his entire career by a pretty wide margin. And the fact is that yes, some fault does have to go to Kevin Labanc, who even in the games where he found himself upwards in the lineup, he never quite actually performed. But at the same time, he wasn't really given that much of a chance either. He was kept on an incredibly short leash, and it's difficult to play your best hockey when you know that you do not have the trust of the coaching staff behind you. Labanc, as a scoring winger, can't really go for those aggressive plays because he knows one wrong step, one mistake, one false move, and he's right back to being a healthy scratch on this Sharks roster. On top of that, he frequently found himself playing just like 5 to 6 minutes a night in a fourth line role with some players who aren't particularly good offensively. Labanc, someone who, as we know from his career year in 18-19, works well off of other really good offensive players. And so it was a situation in which he was kind of set up for failure, and the small moments in which he had to potentially break out, he couldn't quite jump on it. If we take a look at the plus minus here, a minus 27, it is obviously not a very good indication of how he has played, especially when you consider that this occurred in just 46 games. You put this over a full season, Labanc probably could have hit the minus 50 mark had he actually played all of those games. Does not really need any statistic to know that Kevin Labanc is not very good defensively. I wouldn't say he's so much worse than any other San Jose Sharks player that was on the team this past season. A lot of the Sharks forwards did not really help out too much on the defensive side of things, but Kevin Labanc obviously does not excel at that particular part of the game, and that's probably one of the reasons why David Quinn was so much not a fan of Kevin Labanc, and one of the reasons why Kevin Labanc was so much not a fan of David Quinn. Even in the relatively restrained interviews and the things that we get to hear about what Kevin Labanc, his feelings about the San Jose Sharks were, even in those restrained environments, it was quite clear that Labanc was not very happy. And so the fact that the Sharks did not actually re-sign him this offseason, I don't think it catches anybody by surprise there. When it comes to his time on ice, 11 minutes, 37 seconds, very indicative of how he was given sort of assignments this season. This is about in line with like a fourth liner who is an okay fourth liner. Remember, Labanc does not play any shorthanded time, and he gets a decent amount of power play time. So in terms of even strength ice time, he was clearly not very favored for most of the games that he played. As I had already said, there were times where he was getting 5 to 6 minutes. He would be played maybe a few shifts in the first, a couple in the second, and wouldn't get any shifts in the third period. Again, Labanc, David Quinn not seeing eye to eye. Labanc needing a full reset, honestly, in a different environment, but based on how little chances he was given this season and how poorly he did in the very few chances he had, there doesn't seem to be another team out there who is willing to give him a contract, at least not at this point. Maybe some sort of tryout offer once training camps open up. There is still some history of Labanc having success at the NHL level. There's got to be a team out there of the 31 other teams to give him a chance, but currently I don't believe it has happened yet. And so when it comes to his grade, kind of like with Kyle Burroughs, you do have to consider the circumstances of Labanc was not really put into any sort of position to actually find some success this season, but the fact is that offensively he was quite bad, defensively he was bad as was expected, and as such, while his grade is not as terrible as it could have been, it's still quite bad at a D+. Class dismissed.